Welcome to the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. As a surviving sibling myself, I knew that I wanted to share my story, my brother's story. I lost my brother to a homicide in November 2016, and after going through this experience, I knew that I wanted to share my story and his story. And now it's your turn to share your stories. Please note that this episode contains depictions and stories of siblings lost by homicide, suicide, and/or domestic violence. Some people may find these stories activating, triggering, and/or disturbing. Please see our show notes for additional resources and to understand the full content of the episode.
Welcome back to the Surviving Siblings podcast. Today I have Christine Bartlett with me. Christine has a really incredible story she's willing to share with us, and I am excited to dive into it. Her vulnerability is already so inspiring to me. Christine, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I feel like it's a topic that I don't get to talk about a lot just because, like we talked about before, it's just the burden that you don't want to put on other people when you're talking about your grief. So it's just nice to have an open forum, and especially on such an important topic of suicides.
I appreciate you being so open and wanting to share your brother Peter's story today and the fact that he did die by suicide. So I want to dive right in, Christine. If you could just start out by sharing a little bit about the background, Peter's background, your family dynamic, and kind of picture for us, and we'll go through the story.
Okay. So my brother was 3 years younger, Peter, and we lived a relatively normal childhood, grew up with the whole white picket fence. My dad was a cop. My mom was a nurse. So we shared a room together for about 10 years. So we were just always very close growing up. But I think from a young age, Peter just seemed to struggle, like in school. He was diagnosed with learning disabilities from a young age and behavioral stuff, just constantly having like outbursts in class and different things like that. So I don't think I realized at the time, like for me, it just seemed like he was using these outbursts to get away with things and stuff like that. And my parents always tiptoed around him. And I think it was difficult for my mom, my dad to get on the same page with how they wanted to treat him. He was like on and off medications from a young age, just with being diagnosed with ADHD and different things like that. But I think my dad was very anti-meds. My mom wasn't. My mom tried therapy and my dad was on board with that. But I think that kind of caused a little bit of a rift too, just how he wanted to go about everything. But I think school really was just like where it started with him. It was just very hard for him. And then the outburst led to him being bullied in school. And I think just as he got older, it turned more from like his learning disabilities and I think that just really hurt his self-esteem in a lot of ways. And he just carried that into adulthood. And then I think just as he was in adulthood, it turned more into depression and later on more thoughts of suicide too.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I'm already connecting with, and I'm sure a lot of people as well, connecting with your story, Christine, because my parents, although not together and have been divorced for a very long time and are remarried to other people, had different views on helping my brother too. My mother was not into medication. My dad didn't really have a huge opinion about it. That when you said that right away, and we're 3 years apart too. So yeah, I connect with that as well. But yeah, it's interesting when you look back and you watch those things and you're like, now this is all piecing together. So did he go off did he graduate high school, go off to college? Walk us through his adult years and what transpired next for him.
So he was in like not the same school that I went to up until about middle school. And then he ended up going to this more, I think it was just a school that was more specified for his needs at that time. So that's where he ended up doing 8th grade. And then he did high school with that. And he did, it's called like a BOCES program. So half the day he was doing like carpentry and like more hands-on stuff, which he seemed to enjoy. He ended up graduating high school. And then I think he tried college for a class or two, but it just wasn't for him. But then he ended up, so in 2010, that was the year he graduated, my dad ended up passing away suddenly. So I think that kind of just really, at first, I think it helped for whatever reason. It just like kickstarted him in a more positive direction. He had lost a lot of weight and like it just built his confidence up. He had a lot of friends at that time. He had a girlfriend. But then I think the more he gained those things, the more he realized he had to lose. So it was like the second that anything happened with his girlfriend or anything happened with his friends, it just added on to that depression, I feel like. And I think it was like he had all these things all of a sudden and his dad wasn't there to see them. Whereas like him and my dad's relationship was not a bad one growing up, but they did have their issues. And obviously, anytime you lose someone, you're constantly just thinking about the why did I do that or the stupid little fights that you might have had. So I think that was always weighing heavily on him, just being the only man in his life. And so I think that was like the first real big hit for him that kind of started to set him on this struggle more so with the depression.
That's huge. I'm so
Yeah.
sorry you guys lost your father. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's as we know, right? As we all know, all of you listening too, loss changes you, right? And it
Yeah.
changes a lot of things. It changes your perception, it changes your emotions, it changes just all of the above, right? Like all of the above. So
Yeah.
I could see how he's gone through a lot already in school, and then he feels like he's getting his footing, and you guys lose your father, and then it goes from there. So what happened next for him? Was he working? What was he doing after school?
So right before my dad had passed, he had actually helped him get a job. So he was working at the supermarket close by. My brother didn't have his license at the time. So it was like walkable. After my dad passed, obviously my brother wanted to hang on to that job, which he did for a while, but he was always working. He was in and out of jobs, like just more, he worked in the parking lots, like doing carts and stuff like that, like nothing career wise yet. Like he hadn't found what he really wanted to do with his life. But he did always manage to at least have a job, either like working at an A&P or a ShopRite or something like that. So he did that for a while. And then he ended up getting this other girlfriend who he was with when he passed too. So they were together for about 3, maybe 4 years. And I feel like that's when, and nothing to do with her, but just like those 3, 4 years when he had this like serious relationship was like where I remember the most suicide scares and depression and things like that getting ahead. And I really just think it was because he was very in love with her. And it was just this big thing that his happiness all of a sudden was very dependent on her. So that,
Yeah. So it was a very tumultuous period and an intense
yeah,
period for him because he was
yeah.
experiencing, I guess, a love that he really hadn't experienced before.
Yeah. And in the meantime, too, my mom was diagnosed with cancer around, I think it was 2015. So I think that also just added, I think he just had a lot of stuff, like a lot of hardship that had happened to him. And obviously they had happened to me as well. But I think I just luckily had better coping skills and I didn't realize how much he was struggling with all of that stuff. I did to a point, but it was almost more frustrating to me at times because he would just not show up to things or I just felt like I was always left to pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
So it was almost hard for me at times to really recognize that it was really just his depression and not just him like ignoring all of his responsibilities and putting them on me. It was like every chemo appointment, it was always me taking my mom, which was fine, but it was like there was just very little help with that. And we were both very close still, and we lived in very close proximity to my mom. He still lives with her at the time, and I lived about 10, 15 minutes. So it wasn't like we couldn't have shared the responsibilities, but I think that was something that was just hard on me at the time, just not realizing that the reason that he wasn't helping as much was probably just that lack of coping and that lack of just caring about really anything at that time.
That's a whole lot to carry, and I can
Yeah.
connect with that too because my brother struggled as well, as I've shared very openly, with a lot of different things, mental health, drugs, alcohol, things like that, and was very unpredictable. And when you're the oldest, like we are, a lot of things fall to you, especially when there's hardship in the family. And that's a lot. You guys lost your father, your mother's diagnosed with cancer. This is a lot that
Yeah.
is going on. And I can connect with you, and I'm sure a lot of people listening can as well, because when you're the one that's taking on a lot of stuff or taking responsibility and you have a sibling that isn't, and you don't quite have it all pieced together as to why, like, there can be resentment a little bit, right? You're like,
Yeah.
why am I the one doing it? I'm sure you felt that, right, Christine?
Yeah. And I obviously, after his passing, have regretted it a little bit, but just at the time, it's just hard to see past that. There was when our grandmother had actually passed away in 2016, so he could not handle that at all. Didn't end up, and he was very close to her, but he couldn't even go to the funeral. So it was things like that made it a little bit hard to empathize with him because it was just hard to see how you could be in that big of a hole. Yet, like, he ended up going with his girlfriend instead. So for me, it was like, you can do these things for your girlfriend, but then when it comes to your family, you can't. But looking back now, I think it was more just, he just couldn't handle another loss in his life. And he just needed to ignore it to get through his days. And I'm okay with it now. But obviously at the time when you're going through things like that, you're like, what are you doing? But
Oh, absolutely. Again, I relate to this. And yeah, and then you look back and you're like, okay, it's like piecing puzzle pieces together. You're like, oh,
yeah,
that's why. And that you're
yeah,
filling in the blanks there. Was Christine, was Peter ever diagnosed officially? Or tell us a little bit about the actual mental health, because you've said a couple times about his depression. So
yeah.
he was obviously battling depression and battling a lot. And also there was a lot going on in your family, a lot of loss, and that's heavy. Tell us a little bit about the mental health aspect of it, because it does sound like you referred to that a
Yeah.
couple times. So would love for you to share that with us.
Yeah. So it took a very long time for him to be diagnosed with anything. And I don't think I had said this yet, but his eventual suicide was not something that surprised us by any means, which I know most people are like, we had no idea. We didn't see it coming. Whereas for us, unfortunately, it was a call that I dreaded every day for a few years just because of how the road it was going down. But he had a few suicide attempts that we knew about and a few that I'm sure we didn't. But his one one prior to the one that he ended up passing from, he ended up driving to this bridge. And it was actually my mom's like first day of restarting chemo. And I think he just wasn't really ready to tell us, but we just knew something was going on. And he was threatening to jump from the bridge. He thankfully didn't end up doing that. He ended up like going missing for a day or two where he just wouldn't tell us where he was. But when he came home, we like had a serious sit down with him and he agreed to go to this like half day program at least. He didn't ever want to be committed anywhere, but he agreed to go to this like half day program, which he did for a few weeks. And it was in that program that he sat in with a few different types of groups. And he sat in with this bipolar group. And he just felt like everything was matching with how he was feeling. And he ended up calling my mom and I and was like, I think this is what's wrong with me, which he had been seeing a therapist and stuff like that before, but no one had ever gave him a name to what he was feeling. So it wasn't an official diagnosis, but he felt like he was bipolar, which I mean, when we look into it too, we can definitely see like his high of highs and his low of lows and just how drastic things can be from day to day with him. So I think that was the first time where he really felt like he was understood what was happening a little bit more in his mind.
We hope you're enjoying this incredible episode of the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. We'll be back in just a minute after hearing from our incredible sponsor. Are you a bereaved sibling? A forgotten mourner? Or as we call it here on the Surviving Siblings podcast, a surviving sibling? Well, I am too. My name is Maya, and I'm the host of the Surviving Siblings podcast. I created this show for siblings just like you to help you along your grief journey. And now I've created even more resources to help you along this lifelong journey. I wrote the grief guide for the surviving siblings so that you and I can travel along this journey together. Within the guide, it has prompts to help you with a validation exercise that helps you validate your feelings of grief. We also talk about the stages of grief, and we also have a timeline exercise that helps you journal as you continue along your grief journey. I share tips throughout the guide on my personal grief journey as well and what worked for me. You can find this guide on Amazon.com, You can also click the link in the show notes. And of course, you can visit our incredible website, thesurvivingsiblings.com. In addition to finding the grief guide, you'll find merchandise that supports you as the surviving sibling, as well as our show. You'll also find our support group that meets every month, our Ask Me Anything Mondays, and so much more. So make sure to visit thesurvivingsiblings.com for more information, and don't forget to order your grief guide today.
Yeah,
So-
that makes sense that he felt understood, seen, and he could actually connect and not feel like this is only happening to me. This is
Yeah.
a part of his mental health journey. I had no idea we had so much in common, Christine, although we lost our brothers differently and obviously have some 3 years and all of that. But my brother was never officially diagnosed bipolar, but hindsight's 2020. That's a phrase for
Yeah.
a reason. And I look back on his behavior and it was extreme. It was always very extreme. It was like the devastated world. My brother was more on the high side, like there was a lot of highs. But when he came crashing down, oh, honey, it was not pretty. It was not pretty. Do you reflect back and see that? Or tell us a little bit more about Peter, and was he get into depression or what was his pattern?
Yeah, he definitely was always one extreme or the other. There were some days where we would be hanging out, everything would be good, and then immediately the next morning he wouldn't get out of bed. But again, it seemed like once he had different things to hold on to, that his happiness was more just dependent on how his relationships were and different things like that. But he did end up going on medication after this. He was in this program, which seemed to help a little bit. But of course, like along the time, like right around the time that he ended up in this program, he ended up getting this job. So then it was a decision of whether or not he was going to take the job or stay in the program, because it was a half day program. So there was no way to do both.
Right.
And I remember I was the one that like went to the meeting with them and talked to the guy basically that would let him be released from the program. He could have walked, obviously, but and we just thought, I mean, I would have preferred he stayed, I think, a little bit longer, but I also wanted him to have a job and something more realistic that's gonna sustain him and something that he can do every day. Cause I feel like that was a big part of it. Like just him like getting up every day and being forced to get out of the house and actually wanting to do something. So he ended up leaving the program and taking this job, which I don't know if that was the right decision or not, but he did end up having this job for about 6 months too. And this program was probably about 8 months before he ended up passing.
So he took this new job, was he living with his girlfriend? What was the dynamic there?
So he ended up moving. I'm trying to remember. He was probably started dating her around like 2015, 2016. He passed in 2018. So at some point he did move down she lived in Pennsylvania. They had met online, but they were like, they would visit each other often. So then he ended up moving down there, which I think was also a hard decision. It just isolated him. Like obviously me and my mom weren't there anymore. He did have some friends up here still. So it was a very tough decision, but I think he just wanted to try it. He had gotten a job down there at that time, but then he ended up having a suicide attempt down there. So this was prior to the bridge one. He had called us one day and said that he had taken a bunch of pills and drank a bunch of vodka. He wouldn't tell us where he was. So we ended up calling the cop. We were all the way in New York and he was in Pennsylvania. So we were trying to get the cops to go there. So it was just like hours of panic, obviously. They ended up somehow we figured out maybe he was in the attic still and locked himself in there. So they ended up finding him and bringing him to the hospital up in wherever in Pennsylvania. So me and my mom drove there at 11 o'clock at night. And looking back now, I like feel bad how I was obviously devastated when it was happening. He basically said his goodbyes on the phone to us. So I really thought that could be it. But then immediately once I knew he was okay and us driving up there and then seeing him and he was just not remorseful at all. I think he was just not reacting the way that I wanted him to. And then it just made me almost more angry, like, how could you do this to us kind of thing, which again, now knowing what happened, I feel bad and regret feeling that way. But I think in the moment when you have so many like he just would always threaten suicide. So for me, it never felt real because he had said it so many times, and it would just always be at the right moment where it would be like to get out of something, or just it just didn't feel like, obviously I was always scared that it could happen, but
Sure.
his
Yeah.
timing sometimes almost seemed manipulative. So it always just, once I knew he was okay, then I would just immediately get angry and be like, why? Like, why can't we just get help? Because my mom and I were always on board to get him help with whatever he needed. Like, my mom would always said she would pay for anything or whatever he wanted. But it's just, again, I realize more now, if you can't help someone that doesn't want the help, and he needed to get to that point to want the help. And unfortunately, he just really was never there. But anyway, after that happened, my mom was like, you need to come home. And so he ended up leaving that apartment and was living home for, I think that was, I don't know, my timing is off, but he was living home for a while before he passed, and then ended up working like around here. But
Again, thank you for sharing so much and so vulnerably. And you're absolutely right. You can't help someone who does not want help. And that's a really tough part of, I think, so many of our stories, regardless of how we've lost our siblings. There's a lot of us out here that have tried to help our siblings in different ways. And I think it's so frustrating because you can see a path for them, right? Or you can see like a life for them, or you can see how you can help them, but they have to want it. And that's so tough
yeah,
because just you sharing too, where you're like, I feel bad, but then when I look, that's a struggle. And that's something I hear a lot too, Christine, is after losing your sibling, especially by suicide, which I know we're leading up to that. And you're amazing to share this with us. And I appreciate it. But I think there's so many, for a lot of siblings out there that lose a sibling by suicide, there's so many unanswered questions. And I think that's really difficult. And there's also typically mental health is involved, right? And I've yet to hear of a story where it's not. If there's one, share it with me, guys. But this is why we want to talk about this and bring light to this and bring awareness to this, because these are difficult stories and difficult losses that we can help make an impact and potentially change for the future. That would be my hope, right? So it's really frustrating when you're on the other side and you can see how you could help your brother or your sister and they just are not there and they're not receiving it.
yeah,
It's very
yeah,
difficult. Like I told you before we hit record, I was going to share a little bit of my brother. I don't know everything as well that my brother dealt with mental health wise. He struggled his whole life too. He self-medicated with drugs and alcohol, as I've shared. And I have been able to connect with people who have lost a sibling by suicide because of a couple of reasons. But one reason is because my brother did attempt when he was 17. And so my heart really goes out to all of you guys. My brother called me. I was in college. We're 3 years apart. So I was in college, right? I'm, of course, 20 and drinking and partying and doing college things, right? And he called me and he was out of his mind. I don't know what he took, but a bunch of stuff. And told me goodbye. Like he was like, I love you so much. And it was very ominous. So I can connect with getting that kind of call. I can't even imagine going through it multiple times. That was the scariest moment prior to other things happening and losing my brother and other things. So scary. I was frantically calling my mother, her boyfriend at the time. It was scary. And they ended up finding him in the bathtub. So it was very scary, Christine. So again, my heart goes out to you and everybody listening that's lost a sibling by suicide or siblings, God forbid. One of the scariest calls I've ever gotten. I'm
yeah,
like, my 17-year-old brother saying goodbye to me. What are you talking about? Like, how much weed did you smoke? What are you talking about? You don't want to believe it's real. And
yeah.
thank God they went home because the entire house had flooded and he was in the bathtub. It's very intense. This is a very intense topic. So tell us a little bit more about what happened next. So he came home, which love your mama. Yes, she was pulling a mama bear, bringing him up. It's time to come back home. And what leads up to his passing on May 8th? What leads up to that? What goes on next for him?
So now that I'm thinking about timeline wise, I think he
Yeah.
had come home. It was like probably the summer before that bridge attempt. So he had come home. He was living in Pennsylvania, came home maybe like August, I think that had happened around. And then he had that bridge attempt again in October. So then he had gone to that program and got a job around here at home.
Mhm.
And then he seemed to be doing okay. But again, like around the time of that bridge attempt in October, he had broken up with his girlfriend. So then when he had gotten that job, he also had gotten back together with his girlfriend. So we didn't know, is it the program that helped, the medication, the job, or just the fact that obviously he's back with his girlfriend. And he was doing all right. And then the next year, it was just the same stuff. It was just constant. Like some days he was okay, some days he was not okay. And then we ended up actually I got a call in April. So like almost exactly a month before he passed. And he told me that I was living again about like 10-15 minutes away. But he called me and said that this was it again. He was walking, he was gonna go on the train tracks. And so I like immediately started speeding home. I had told my mom, but there wasn't really much she could do at that time anyway. So I came home and I was trying to find him. And every time that this had happened where I'd gotten calls in the past, my friends were always like, "Why don't you just call the cops?" But for me, I didn't want to call the cops. And I knew once I called the cops, my brother would stop calling me because I think he just did not want the cops to get involved at all. And he felt comfortable enough to call me, which I appreciated, even though it was very traumatizing every time I got the call. But I was happy that at least he felt comfortable enough to call me and vent out his feelings. And usually I was able to get those phone calls to go a different way. So he would call, he would cry. I would at least try and talk him out of it. Or if I could find him, I would obviously be there. But this call just felt different. And I didn't know if I was going to I couldn't find him at the time. So I was just like driving around. He just seemed like very out of it. He wasn't a drinker at all, but that past year, he was like, I feel like just using it to almost try and kill himself at those times too. But he sounded like he had drank. I couldn't find him. So I had told my mom to call the cops. So we had the cops looking for him in the neighborhood and I ended up finding him. So of course, then I regretted calling the cops, but I found him. He was willing to get into my car. He wasn't on the train tracks, but very close to it. And he came back home. But then the cops, obviously, since we called them, ended up coming and they ended up taking him in, which was a whole scene in itself because my brother was not willing to go. They ended up having to tase him and stuff, which was just
Oh my
awful to
God,
see.
Christine.
I
Wow.
just, I felt like at that point, my brother just felt like I betrayed him, which I felt so bad. But I think after that, he realized why I did it. But obviously, in the moment, he was just like, how could you guys call the cops and stuff? But we ended up going to the hospital that night. I went with him and they let him go. They had him handcuffed there.
Wait, what?
They
They didn't do a 72-hour hold? They let him go?
No. Yeah, which to this day still makes me so angry, but we had a psychiatrist came and talked. I wasn't allowed there when the psychiatrist or whoever talked to them, but they talked to him and he did his like normal manipulative, this is how I'm going to get out of it kind of ways. He said, I'll go to this program, I'll do this. He had to fill out this whole like coping mechanism sheet, which I mean, was so sad to see because I'm like, clearly he's not coping if I just found him on the train tracks, but he just had to, the psychiatrist talked to me and asked my opinion. I said, I don't think he's safe to go home. I said, this is like not the first time. It's not the second time. And I just think that there needs to be a plan in place or something to before we let him go back home. But I think because he was over 18 and all that, it's really, I don't know. I don't understand how any of it works. And it still bothers me to this day. But he agreed just verbally that he would do that same program he did in October. And they let him walk out the doors without anything. And he went back home and he told me he was going to go to the program the next day and then didn't go. And I was looking back at texts today, just trying to refresh my memory of things. And I had texted him how hurt I was because I was like, you put us through all this stuff and we're obviously there for you no matter what. But there's only so much that we can do without you doing anything yourself too. And he had just said that he doesn't want to do the program. It didn't really help him. He wants to do all this other stuff and he just wants us to be willing to be on board with whatever he wants to do to help himself. But I was like, actions speak louder than words. You're not like, at this point, we're not doing anything. It's the same thing every day. It's just wondering like when we're going to get the call. And it sounds terrible to say, but yeah. So then he didn't end up going back to the program. And yeah,
It doesn't sound terrible at all, Christine. I think when you're constantly living, waiting for the call, that's literally my first episode on this entire
yeah,
show is the call. And that's a form of anticipatory grief, right? And loss. Like you are basically, and there's different forms of this, but for you guys, every time you get a call from him, it's or waiting for
yeah,
the call. You're on edge all the time. And that's very difficult. That's very difficult. And that is a form of anticipatory grief, which I'm sure. And you lived it, you're living it. And that takes a toll on you. It takes a toll on you mentally,
yeah,
emotionally, physically. And I think a lot of people listening to this can relate to that. It's not if you've lost someone by suicide, it can be that way, but it can be for people that are watching their sibling go through an addiction, go through mental
yeah,
health, go through a disease, fill in the blank. But anticipatory grief is, it's really, you lived it, you went through it. And that's very difficult. And when you're trying to
yeah,
help someone and I'm still blown away that they didn't keep him.
yeah.
I
I
can't
know.
believe they just let him go because typically it's a 72-hour hold. But to your point, some people know how to manipulate and get out of these supposed regulations that are in place for mental health.
Yeah,
It's completely broken in our country, but we'll get to that. But yes, Peter's out and saying he's going to get help, but clearly doesn't.
yeah,
How does this lead up to back at the bridge again? This is a
yeah.
tough time. Yeah.
So I think the whole month was rough after that, but I knew in my heart if he was ever going to try again, he was not going to let me know at that point because he wasn't going to go back to, he just knew that we would try and stop it again, which I think before, like we let him, like we never called the cops or did anything. So I knew once I made that call, that was it for us. Like it was either going to happen or it wasn't going to happen, but we weren't going to know before and have that call that we would usually get prior at least to try and talk him out of it. So I don't really remember how he was like that whole month. I don't remember it being great. But the week before it happened, I was on vacation from work. We had just gotten a puppy. Our dog had passed like 2 weeks before. And my mom randomly got a puppy. So me and my brother spent like the entire week with her. I spent the entire week with him. Like we just were able to hang out. We hung out the whole day before. Like I was with him all day. We got lunch and then everything seemed okay. And he kicked me out of his room like he normally did, like that night. He was like, "You're annoying." So I like went back to my apartment. And then the next morning I came back to my mom's house to see the puppy and I had told him I was there. So he came outside with me for a little bit and he just seemed off, but not more off than other days, but definitely just seemed a little down. But he hung out with me for a little bit. He was talking to me. And then he went back in the house and I heard him get into a fight with his girlfriend. So that obviously worried me because anytime like things were off with that, it just seemed like the world was just not good. I,
Right.
I heard him get into the fight and then he ended up leaving. And I thought he liked to walk everywhere, but at this time he did have his license. So I thought he had walked and usually he would just walk to the grocery store. So I called him and I was like, "Oh, where are you?" And he said he was going to the grocery store. And again, he actually didn't seem as off on the phone. He seemed a little bit more, now that I'm looking back, I think he just seemed content because I think he had his intentions in his head. But I was like, "Oh, do you mind just picking me up this like juice that I wanted?" And he said, "Sure, I'll get it now." He acted like he was at the grocery store at the time. And I was like, "All right, cool." I like sent him a picture of the juice I wanted. And I said, "Is everything okay with you and his girlfriend?" And he said, "Yeah, everything's fine." And I was like, "Fine. Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah." So that was it. And then that was at like maybe 4:30. And an hour later, I was still at my mom's and I saw he posted on Facebook a status saying I'm no one's favorite, which just threw me a little bit. I just didn't have a good feeling in my stomach. I
Sure.
tried calling him. He didn't answer. And I called him like multiple times. I was messaging him on Facebook, texting him, and just nothing. I was like, if you just let me know you're okay, I swear I will stop bothering you.
Yeah, you
But
had
nothing.
sister's intuition was kicking in here for
Yeah.
sure. Yep.
And then I even started texting one of my friends and I was like, I just feel like something's off. Like, obviously, I've gotten this feeling before, but it just seems like something's wrong. Like, I'm terrified that a cop is going to show up at my door right now. So, my mom was still at work. So, I had texted my friend that I was like, I need to leave. I think I just feel like a cop is going to show up. And she's like, well, I'm sure he's okay. Just wait until you hear from him, whatever. So, I went back to my apartment. And at that point, we still hadn't heard from them. And my mom had been at work, so she didn't know that anything was wrong. When she got home and saw he wasn't there, she started freaking out. And I was like, I tried calling him, but he seemed like he was okay when I talked to him at least. So then I started calling him again and his phone was like, it wasn't even ringing anymore. So I had texted my friend saying, I'm nervous, his phone is off. And she was like, well, that's a good thing. At least he shut it off. And I said, yeah, or he jumped off a bridge. And so my mom was like, you need to get home. I need you at least here until he comes home. So I was like, that's fine. So I went to her house. But as I was driving, she called me and she said, where are you? And I said, I'm on my way, like I said. And she said, you need to get here now. And I said, I'm almost there. I was literally like 5 minutes from my house. And I was like, is everything okay? And I think she was trying not to tell me, obviously, while I was driving, but she was also by herself and she just screamed, he's dead. And I honestly blacked out after that. I don't even remember really driving home. I ended up with a flat tire. So I
Oh
can
my
only
God.
imagine what those like 3 minutes drive. I was very close to my house, but I sped home. And when I got home, the sheriff was there and he had told us that he jumped. And the only thing that we're grateful for is that they found him so quickly. Someone had actually seen him jump. So they were able to find him and recover him rather quickly. So it wasn't like we had days waiting to see like even what happened. We wouldn't have known at all like where he was. That part, I guess, was good. But yeah, it
I'm
was a
sure
lot.
a complete blur at that point. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you definitely got a call that you
Yeah.
finally got the final call, which is in your situation is so devastating. I can understand blacking out. You're driving and then you get this news. Like it's your story is really interesting and just blows me away because your intuition is so strong, Christine. Do you have a
Yeah.
strong I don't want to get too off topic here, but I have to ask you this. Do you have a strong intuition in general, or do you think it was just because you guys are so connected, or all of the
I like to think I'm intuitive, but
Yeah.
that day was very weird when I think back about it. Like even to the point, like I think they said he jumped around like 5:47 and I called him at 5:44 or something. Like
Oh my God, I have chills. That's crazy.
and then
Literally, whoa. That's
and the time
crazy.
that I had texted my friend saying I need to leave because the sheriff, I feel like they're gonna come. I think he said he started coming he came every hour until someone was there. And he started coming at 7:30 or something. And I think I left at 7:20 something. So I had just missed him. And I had just said that to my friend too, because I just had that overwhelming feeling. But I don't know. I don't know why I like was sent those feelings because I wasn't able to do anything about it, unfortunately. But whenever I think back on that day, I'm like, it was just so weird the way everything happened and just the feelings I was getting all day. But
I'm not a believer
so,
in coincidence. I think death does that to you. You know what I
yeah.
mean? And when you're telling your story, I'm like blown away because like literally like you're following along intuitively with what happened. And I'm so sorry that you lost your brother by suicide and his struggle. And it affects the whole family when you're going through mental health, when you have someone who's struggling with mental health and this whole, as you're sharing so openly, but I'm really blown away by your intuition. So yes, I'm going to tell you that you're very intuitive. And I've shared this before too, but it blew me away in the loss of my brother because I was at dinner the night before and I looked at my then boyfriend and said, I need to call my brother because I hadn't seen him in a while. I just felt like he wasn't doing well. I'm like, I need to call him. He's okay, we'll call him tomorrow. And then I got the call the next day. And
Yeah.
that's why I wanted to ask. I was like, there is a thing. There is such a thing when you are really connected to your sibling. You just know it,
Yeah.
like things come up, and that's just wow. Like like in the timeline, I'm blown away by that, Christine. Tell us a little bit what it was. And but I also want to say this too. I connect with how you're saying we are grateful, or at least that they found him, and you weren't sitting home and going, "Where is he? Where is he?" And even though it's definitely not the outcome any of us want, I think you have a really just great way of saying, I'm grateful for this part of this, but in such tragedy, I never really like to say silver lining because there's not one. You've lost a
Yeah.
sibling, right? You've lost your brother. I lost my brother. And you guys have lost siblings listening to this, I'm assuming. And, but sometimes when you reflect back, and I think your story is a great example of this, you can see where you're like, at least, I got this part. But it's okay for us to say that. No one else can say that to us. Just want to add that no one else can say that to us. We can say that, but I really commend you for
Yeah.
saying that. So now it's you and your mom, and tell me a little bit about what that was like afterwards. Tell us.
Yeah. So it was horrible, just in the sense that I think you've touched on this a lot on your podcast. Just it's very hard as a sibling to be able to grieve when you still have surviving parents, because my first thought is obviously I like was just in shock and just miss my brother. But then I have my mom who just is completely devastated, cannot cope. I was just more concerned about her. And at this time, she was still battling cancer too. So it was just a lot that I was just nervous more for her than anything else. So I feel like my grieving was not able to start for a while after he passed. So I more went into like detective mode. Like I wanted to know everything on his last moments. Like we didn't have his phone obviously, but I like cracked every password he had. I went to every Google search he had, which I saw he had up until I think when he was on the bridge, he was Googling, he jumped off the Bear Mountain Bridge and he was Googling like Bear Mountain Bridge suicide, like bridge suicide, like all this stuff. And then when I was looking back months before, he had been Googling about suicides and stuff for almost like 2 full years. So
Oh my
it
God.
was something that clearly was on, it made me feel awful, but also at the same time, I was like, this is clearly something that is I don't think there's anything I could have done that would have ever been able to it was just so ingrained in his brain at that point, and he was clearly just so depressed, and as much as he could hide it from other people, and, like, I did know he was depressed and stuff, and it wasn't hidden from me, I that extent of it, like, of it being as real as it was, I don't think it hit me until I saw all those Google searches and everything. But it did take a little bit of weight off because I was like, "Okay, this is something he's been thinking about," which again, I knew, but it wasn't just one trigger that this happened. Like, his fight with his girlfriend, I think, weighed on my mom's head a lot. She was
Of
like, "It's
course.
her fault," at first, and I never really felt that way. I was the one that told her my brother's girlfriend, like, I called her that night and waited obviously until she was, like, with her parents and stuff, but I didn't have any resentment towards her because I feel like my brother has always been like, we were just waiting for that one trigger, basically. It's not like he had just been firing blanks for so many years, and we were lucky enough that anytime he tried, it didn't end up working. But it was just always a matter of what that final trigger would be, not really a matter of if it was going to happen or not. I don't know. It was a lot, just like uncovering a lot of stuff. And then I had to obviously go pick up his car from the bridge and just different things like that you don't even think of. Like, even when I got to pick up his car and they charged me for the tow fee, and I was like, wait, what? My brother just died. But you don't like, it doesn't matter to the rest of the world.
The world keeps going on, and you're like, how dare
Yeah.
you? How dare you? Are you kidding?
Yeah.
What?
So little things like that, I'm like, wait, what? But it was hard. It was definitely a hard few weeks. And obviously, like years after, but definitely the first few weeks was just hard. Just with all, I think with a suicide death, it's just very different with the guilt you feel and just every conversation you go through and every what if. And like with my dad, it was a sudden death. So it was different. I never had those feelings. I had little things like, oh, I wish we didn't fight about whatever, but it
Yep.
wasn't any of those. Could I have stopped it? Because I knew I couldn't. He had a heart attack. It was what it was. Whereas like my brother, I was the last person to see him. I was the last person to even talk to him on the phone. Like everything was me, I felt like at that point. And I just felt very responsible, which I've since let go of all that. But the first, like, when it first happened, it was just hard just feeling that burden. But
Of course, and I'm sure a lot of people listening can understand, relate, especially if they lost a sibling by suicide, because there are totally different feelings that all of us feel, and they are based on how we lose our sibling. And I never like to say this is worse or diminish one thing or another, but you're absolutely right. There's a whole other side of things that happen depending on the loss. And with suicide, those what ifs, oh man, it is so tough. So thank you for sharing that. And I you remind me of myself because I went on a detective journey myself too, but in a different way.
yeah,
And I can definitely understand and empathize why you would be like, okay, I need to go through the Google search. And I can understand why not necessarily it gave you relief, but helped you move forward in understanding like, okay, like I couldn't stop this. This is something he had been thinking of. This is not something he just did on a whim one day. And
yeah,
that I'm sure helped you move forward to the point now where you're able to share so openly with us. Or what are like that's a part of it, but what else helped you, Christine? Because I think that is really hard losing a sibling by suicide. How do you move forward from the what ifs? What could I have done? How did you do that? Because part of it is you becoming the detective and going into Google. And I love that you shared that. But do you have anything else that really helped you get to this point where you're able to share so openly about your brother's death and how it happened from 2018 to 2023? That's pretty incredible. There's people that can't talk about it for their entire life.
yeah. I think for me, I just had to realize that I did the best I could with what I knew at the time and the tools that I had at the time. Like, I think my mom and I, like, for a while were like, how could we have not stopped this? But I think we didn't realize how long we also prolonged it. Like, we had so many more years with him because we were able to deter him, like, from a lot of those calls that he gave us. And I think it helps me to know that he was so comfortable talking to me. Like, he knew he wasn't gonna get judgment from me. Like, I'm at the point now where I don't think I was the issue. I don't think my mom was the issue. Like, he always could come to us. He knew that. I think the issue, unfortunately, is that he just felt judged by the rest of the world. And I think that's just like, the issue that we have with mental health right now is that stigma that's there. And I think if he had felt more comfortable around other people expressing it, because obviously I knew his struggles and people close to us knew his struggles, but people out in the everyday world didn't know anything. Like, they were all shocked when it happened and texting me and calling us like, "Oh my God, we had no idea." And I feel like if he felt like he had those people or even his friends, like, to open up to and explain how he felt, he just would have been able to cope a little better. Like, it's hard to have something, like, deal with something and just feel so isolated with it. And I think that just added so much to it. So I think for me, it just helped knowing that I was there as best I could. Obviously, I look back now and there's so many things I wish I would have said or could have said differently, but I didn't know as much at the time. Like, for me, I was dealing with a lot, like, with him, but also, like, with my mom and different things. And I was just trying to get through every day as well, while also trying to help him. And I just, I don't know, you don't really know how to help someone, especially when they don't know how to help themselves. So the only thing you can do is just be there for them, which I do feel like I was always there for him. And I know he knew that, but I just wish things would change with other people and how they view mental health, because I do feel like that's obviously a big issue.
Yeah, that's where I was leading us next in our last couple minutes together, Christine, because that's why it's so important people like yourself share stories like Peter's, right? And when you're ready, you're ready to share it and we're opening up about it, but it breaks my heart the stigma that we have on mental health. It breaks my heart the stigma that we have on so many different things. Losing someone by suicide, there's a stigma to that. There should not be a stigma to that, but should is a very tricky word. There shouldn't be a stigma to anyone that's struggling with drug addiction. There shouldn't be a stigma. We can keep going down the list with all of these
Yeah.
things, right? And the only way that we can change that is by sharing these stories so that people feel more comfortable opening up and we erase the stigma as much as possible, because it's wild to me, because some people don't want to say how their sibling passed away because it's shameful to them, or when it involves these death by suicide, homicide, drugs, alcohol. These people in these situations, our siblings that we've lost in these horrific ways, we're struggling. And I think it's really important that we bring awareness to it. And the only way we can do that, and the only way we can stomp the stigma, is what I'd like to say, is by just being open and vulnerable and honest about it.
Yeah. I think for me too, watching, 'cause obviously, like I said, my mom was battling cancer and my brother was battling this mental health illness at the same
Right.
time.
Mhm.
And I just feel like people don't see that mental health is just a disease in the brain, just as cancer is a disease of whatever organ or blood or whatever it is. And people see those two things so differently. And I get it because I'm guilty of it at times too. Obviously, I would get more frustrated with my brother when he was in his like doing something as opposed to my mom when she was feeling sick. But
Sure.
looking back now, it's just crazy because my mom was offered so much sympathy and everyone, which she should have, obviously, but like everyone was constantly worrying about her. If she didn't feel like doing something for the day, people understood it. Whereas my brother, constantly people were questioning like what kind of treatment he was going to do and like why wouldn't he get out of bed that day and just different things that he did. And it was just, and no, like my brother didn't even feel comfortable, obviously, even opening up to people, but even people that did know, like it was hard for them to provide that empathy to him. And whereas to my mom, it was no question every day, like constantly, how are you feeling? How are you doing? So just watching the two dynamics of that was just eye opening to me of how different we really see mental health diseases compared to anything else that you
Right.
can physically see. So
Ugh.
I think that was hard, but I hope that changes somehow.
It starts with us, right? And sharing
Yeah.
these stories. And it starts with you, right? You are sharing that. And I think what you just said is so powerful, Christine, that your mom, people knew she was battling cancer. And there's empathy, there's sympathy, there's, oh my gosh, oh gosh, you want to stay at home, you want to stay in bed. And that's absolutely what we want. We want empathy and love and sympathy in the world for people that are going through difficulties. But just because you can't see it, or it hasn't been perfectly diagnosed, or it's something that we're learning more about, we the empathy and the sympathy, it's very real. Clearly Peter was struggling. Clearly
Yeah.
Peter was going mental health. That's illness too. That's an illness. And I think sometimes it's difficult for people because they want to define it, and they're like, I know someone who's depressed and, they got on Zoloft and now they feel better. Great. Like, I know people that have done chemo and gone through radiation and survived cancer. How is that?
Yeah.
We've seen it as different. I understand that it is different, but it's not different at the same point, because
Yeah.
you're struggling with an illness. And I think being really open about it and bringing more awareness to it, and just sharing so much about how Peter struggled, and this was not his first attempt, I think, and I hope it's eye opening for people. What advice would you give, Christine, to our amazing siblings that are listening that have lost a sibling by suicide? What's a piece of advice that you would give? Because I feel like you're just a wealth of knowledge. We could probably talk about this for another hour, to be honest. But you've come a long way from your
Yeah.
detective days and your what ifs. And I feel like you're always going to feel some of that, but you've evolved and you've moved forward in your grief journey, and you're always going to carry your brother with you, of course. But what's some advice that you can give? Because I don't have this experience, right? And you
Yeah.
do. And I really value you sharing this. What's some advice you would give? Even going back to yourself, if you could talk to yourself back in
Yeah.
2018. Yeah.
I would, if I'm talking to myself, I would just tell myself not to be so hard on myself. Because again, it's the immediate thought you have when it's a suicide or something that seems preventable or is to blame yourself and to start thinking that. And I just think you need to realize that the relationship that you had with the person, whether or not it was good or bad, but there's things that you definitely contributed to keeping them alive longer. And it, unfortunately, they're always going to find that trigger that's going to send them. It's not, I don't know, it's not on you is what I can say. But
No, I think that's great advice because I think that's our natural reaction, right? When losing a sibling by suicide is what could I have done? What could I, and you've
yeah,
expressed that throughout this entire episode. And I think when you're able to release that, it was, it was probably life changing for you, right? When you were able to release that and realizing that there's nothing you could have done. And we don't know that we're going to lose our sibling. Like, this is more generalized. So, of course, we're going to have regrets from like, oh, I wish I didn't talk to him like that or her like that, and
yeah,
things like that. I think losing a sibling by suicide, that gets very exasperated. Wouldn't
yeah,
you agree from your experience?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think also I realized, and I remember, I think my mom had told me this actually when my dad had passed, but when I was just dealing with a lot of that guilt and struggling with that. And she was like, what if you twisted it? What if, God forbid, like something had happened to me and it was my dad or my brother still alive? Like, I wouldn't want to be watching, like looking down on them, having all of those thoughts of guilt and stuff. And I'm sure my brother, even though there's things I wish I could have said, I'm sure if I was the one who had passed and my brother was here, he would be thinking of all the stuff he put me through and all of that. And I wouldn't want that for him either. Like, it's just, there's going to be guilt no matter what. And you just have to be able to release that and realize that you did the best you could at that time. And obviously now I know so much more about mental health than I did back then. And I feel like it is a lot more prevalent in the world, which I am happy about. I wish it was a little more prevalent in 2018, which I don't feel like it was as open of a topic. Or
Well,
maybe I just
I
was,
agree. The pandemic changed a lot of
yeah,
things for us. And that's one of the points. That's when it's okay to see a silver lining
yeah,
because the pandemic did have that silver lining
yeah,
where it did bring mental health out. But you lost your brother before the pandemic. And it was,
yeah,
you are right. In 2018, I did not feel like I could share with people that I took antidepressants or and that's just me dealing with PTSD from my brother's death. I can't
yeah.
imagine what it was like for your brother Peter, struggling at that level. My heart just goes out to him, watching down on us, hopefully, while we
Yeah.
do this. Yeah. Anything else you want to add, Christine, before we wrap up? Again, thank you so much for sharing your story and Peter's story, your family's story with us. It's been amazing. Thank you.
No, I hope people know mental health does not define the person. Like, my brother was an amazing person. I love spending every second, or not every second, but most seconds with him. We obviously knew how to push each other's buttons, but I just hope to be able to let everyone know that he mattered. And yeah, that's it. I just don't want people to think that like the way someone died defines how they lived.
So beautiful and so true. There's no shame in sharing your story, regardless of how your sibling passed away. And
Yeah.
I just love that. I think that's a beautiful sentiment. And yeah, it doesn't define them. It doesn't define them.
Yeah.
And it's not who they are. And I love that, Christine. Christine, if people want to connect with you for more support because you are so open about the loss of your brother, Peter, by suicide, how can they connect with you? How are you comfortable with us sharing?
I have my Instagram. I believe it's Christine B with 2 E's 33.
Fabulous.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I am.
Fabulous. We'll tag that in the show notes. Christine, I, again, want to thank you so much for sharing your story, sharing Peter's story, your
Yeah.
family's story. I know this is going to help so many of our siblings out there who've lost a sibling by suicide. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and letting me share his story. Appreciate
My pleasure.
it.
And thank you guys so much for listening to the Surviving Siblings podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to the Surviving Siblings podcast. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did creating it for you, then share it on your chosen social media platform. And don't forget to tag us at Surviving Siblings Podcast so that more surviving siblings can find us. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And don't forget to follow us on all social media platforms. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Surviving Siblings Podcast. All links can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out too. Thank you again for the support. Until the next episode, keep on surviving my surviving siblings.